I don't think you want to just give away my streaming keys like that. Hey, the crew just did the old GitHub checked in my secrets thing. Watch the video during keynote. Reset. Good morning. How's everybody doing? That's the expected third day. Yay. I'm going to go through just a couple community-related things, if you will. I want to start with you. This has been a common theme. I started by getting on the stage on Monday and said, something special will happen. There's a few, how many people in here run other events? I know there's a couple of folks. So, I think about success. Some people think about success as numbers. I think about success as engagement and the things that happen as a offshoot of the platform that's been created. And when I look at this time together versus the time together only 8 months ago, I see things like everybody hanging out in the market longer. I see, where's Homer? Homer's kid trying to get married. I see people in the barn 2 hours longer than they were before, playing games at the Bayo bar. And it just makes me proud to see you all interacting and making those connections. It makes me proud that you have leaned in and done this. And I think that's the special part that happens when we get together, right? Numbers are great. Numbers bring diversity. They give resources so that we can do things. And that's great, right? Different outside experiences. The more that are there, the more that diversity is there, and we'll grow down here, in part because you're going to make that happen. You're going to go back, well, I hope you're going to go back and say, hey, I had this really good time, I met this person, and hopefully the community becomes just part of your conversation in the other things that happen. So with that, I want you all to just reflect on that. There's a whole day of activities yet still to happen. Just because it's the third day doesn't mean it's over. So thank you. Give yourselves a round of applause. Thank you for leaning in. Thank you for being just awesome people, awesome humans. It just makes me proud to be part of this. Wish I could get that trademarked. After the conference, or when the conference next week, how about that? You're going to see some changes on the website. We're going to split that.us. We're going to put the in-person stuff on thatconference.com. And we're going to refocus, if you will, refactor. Maybe it'll just be words better. That.us so that we can focus better on global open spaces, all of this, kind of the continuation in between the events. So you're going to hear a lot from me in the coming year. I'm looking for a lot of feedback from you as to how we can do this and evolve it. We've been heads down for 3 years trying to build that.us. Our traffic hasn't necessarily gone up and to the right, and mostly our problem. But you're the community who I expect to use it. You're my customer, if you will. And if I take my product hat, I want to have these conversations with you. Where does my UI suck? Where's the spelling errors? It happens. It's me. I really rely on that little squiggly or Grammarly. So I'm excited about where that's to go, and having everybody involved and hopefully making something that changes how we interact online. Closing, obviously, it's at 4 o'clock, some raffles, some good swag to get given away. And let's talk about Bekah. who's nervous. So I love how things kind of all come together. It's just amazing. So Bekah sends me a picture. Oh, I didn't put my glasses on. And it's a screen snap from Dad. And Dad's watching right now, so hi, Dad. My name's Clark. It says, this went to the family. Just want to let you know that the guy, me, Clark, just in case you were curious, come on, dang it. On the podcast, did I mention that we started a podcast called That Podcast? Said that Beck was a great human, just saying. Dad, you raised a damn good kid, and you should be really proud. I met Bekah as a result of just having conversations and the flywheel effect of other things going on. Oops. I met Taylor as a result of other things that were going on. Like, relationships happen through things, because of your involvement, because of stepping in. So I see this stuff on Twitter, it's still a thing, and she's talking about how she got, her keynote got canceled, whatnot, and I think I was talking to you, James, maybe about it. So what I do is go scope this person out, and is this person cool? What are they doing online? Whatnot. So I slide into her DMs, which apparently I'm not supposed to say is Gen X because it sounds creepy. I guess that's just for millennials. And I'm like, hey, would you like to chat about potentially doing a keynote? And of course, the next thing I know, we're talking on the phone, and you just get energy with somebody. You sit down and you talk, and next thing you know, you're like, I want to be best friends with this person. I want to be best friends with Bekah and Amy Dutton and James and, well, all of you for that matter. And I'm just like, this person needs the stage. This person has a story, has an energy, a connection about her that needs to be felt by others. So when I say she's an awesome human, I absolutely mean it. I'm so excited to have her take the stage. I think we often get really caught up in the mechanical. How do I do a thing? And we don't reflect on ourselves. We had a long conversation last night about you need to focus on you, right? We all need to, as James said, take a little time for us. If you're my age, 22, and you're a dude, like, mental health is starting to become a big thing that we're not talking about. That's a problem. But I'm just super stoked to have her on stage. I couldn't be more grateful. And with that, let's welcome the not scared and very awesome Bekah.
Thank you.
You got this. Hold on. Hi, Dad.
Woo. Hi, everyone. Let me make sure. Wait. Go back. We're at that conference, in case you didn't know. And I am very grateful to be here, to be able to speak in front of you all, and to be able to have shared this time with you. This is my first experience with that conference, and it's been such a great experience, and the connections that are being made and the things that are being done differently here to create that community has made it a very special place. In case you didn't know, we'll be back here 2024, January 29th through February 1st, so mark your calendars. How many of you, and there's actually a CFP going on right now for that conference, Wisconsin, I believe. How many of you are going to apply to that CFP? All of the hands are away. If you haven't applied yet, and maybe you're a little nervous, maybe you're applying for the first time, hopefully this talk will help you a little bit to find the story that you want to tell, and to tell it in a way that only you can tell that story. I want to say thank you to all of the sponsors who are making that conference happen. and for supporting all of the speakers. And I especially want to say thank you to Clark and the team for making everything run so well and making this feel like such a great community, and also doing their best to make me feel less nervous about everything I do, because that's what I do. I just be nervous all the time. So today I'm talking to you about the power of storytelling. And why are we talking about the power of storytelling at a tech conference? What difference do stories make? Stories make all the difference. And today we're going to talk about why they make a difference and why humans are built for storytelling. And so I'm not going to make you stand up like James did, but I am going to make you do some work, okay? So if you have a notepad or a piece of paper, or if you have a laptop that you want to take out, or a phone, I'm going to ask you to be doing a little bit of writing, okay? So if you hated writing in high school or college or whatever, I'm not going to apologize. You're going to do it, okay? And you're going to share with us these stories. So let's jump into our very first activity. We want to think about the stories that we have to tell. All of us have a story to tell, and we'll all tell our stories in our own ways. So if you're feeling like a skeptic right now, like I don't really need stories, I'm going to ask you to put that aside for the next hour and a half or so, and I really want you to try to engage. So the first thing that I want you to do, I'm going to ask you what might seem like a simple question, but it's actually kind of challenging. I want you to think of one word that describes you, that describes who you are. And I know that I'm only asking you for one word, but that often requires a lot of thought. And I want you to write down that word, okay? So I'm going to give you a little bit of time to think about this as I go through. You know, maybe you're a proud person. Maybe you're a nervous person. Maybe you're energetic. You're not allowed to say complex. That's the only word that I don't allow anyone to say, because we're all complex. That's cheating, right? So think about that. Who has a word? Yell it out. Curious. I like it. Enthusiastic. Good. Tenacious. Awesome word. One more. Someone give me one more. Quiet. That's fantastic. All right, hold on to that word. We're going to be building around it. Now, I want you to think about maybe some important people or places in your lives. And I want you to write those down too. Okay, so often when we have an important person or an important place, there's a memory that's attached to that. So we're going to explore a little bit of those memories, and we're going to think about why they are important to us. So as you're thinking about that memory, as you're thinking about that person or that place, also think about your word. How does that person or place relate to the word that you're using for yourself? Where do these memories come from? Now, think about that. Jot down some notes. This doesn't have to be a full story, and it doesn't have to make sense to anyone but you. I'm not going to ask anybody to come up on stage and to share their story today. I'm not going to ask you to turn to the person next to you and share your story. But I want you to work on developing this. So this doesn't have to be a major event. It can be a small moment in your life. A time that you felt hopeful. A time that you felt scared. A time that you did something that you didn't think that you can do. And think about that way that you felt. Why did you feel that way? Where did that emotion come from? Where did the connection to the person or the place happen? How did that connection feel? Now, if you're still not really sure what to write about, my favorite story to write about is an origin story. I'm like a huge fan of origin stories. So maybe start there. And it can be whatever origin story you want. You know, maybe it's your first job in tech. Maybe it's the first time you gardened. Maybe it's the first time you got on a stage of people and overcame your fears and delivered a talk, right? Maybe it's the first time you fell in love. But often those moments where we're experiencing something for the first time, those are the moments that stick with us because we go through an entire journey to get to that place. Think about that for a minute. and think about it as we go through the rest of this talk. All right, so you can take a break. You can continue to jot down notes if you want, but now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about why we are made for storytelling. We are actually hardwired for storytelling. So the neurons in our brains light up. These are neurons are in your brain, and they use electrical and chemical signals to transfer messages. And when we hear a story, that we connect to, a good story, those neurons in our brains light up. So we know that we're being activated in a different way, in a way where we are engaged. And our bodies also produce oxytocin, which is a neurochemical, and it's often known as like the love hormone, right? It's not all about love. What oxytocin is about is connection. It's about memory. It's about remembering who those people are that made you feel that way in that moment. And along with this, we also have this part of the brain that's called the hippocampus. And I'm not going to get too sciencey here, but the hippocampus is part of the brain that helps us to weave storytelling. It helps us to make these connections, and it helps us to take disjointed stories that might not make sense to us in the moment, and it creates this narrative that we remember. And one of the things that we know as human beings is that our stories, our own personal stories, they don't really follow a plot line, right? Like, we're full of these disjointed stories, but it makes up us. It makes up who we are. And our brain literally has a mechanism to connect this and help us to connect to other people. And so maybe some of you remember this plot diagram from when you were in school, and maybe there's some groans out there. It's okay. It's totally appropriate to groan at any time during this talk. Go for it. But this is the storytelling that we're used to. And we like to follow these stories, right? So I'll just go over this a little bit to remind you all. We have this exposition. And the exposition of a story is like, where is this person right now in their life? Where is the character when we first meet them? And as I'm kind of telling my story, there's this old version of Bekah that you'll meet, okay? That's who I was in that moment before I came into tech. And then we have this rising action, okay? So something happens where the character or you have to make a decision, you have to make a change. And so as you're making this change or deciding whether or not to make this change, this is where the rising action comes into play. And then you hit that climax, which is that moment of biggest impact or biggest emotion that you'll feel. It's that moment where I can't be old Bekah anymore. I make this decision, and now new Bekah happens. And as a result, I start to fit into that role. I start to find out who I am and see what shoes I fall into now after I've made this decision, after this moment of impact has happened. And that's the falling action that helps me settle into who I am. And then the denouement, which is kind of like the conclusion, or who am I now in this moment? What is my story now? And so as part of this, I have all of these stories in my life, these disjointed stories that come together that make me who I am. And my hippocampus helps me to put all of these together. And when I tell you all of these disjointed stories, maybe they'll still seem like disjointed stories, but I think by the end, you'll come to see that all of these stories make up me. These make up the things that are important to telling who I am and the story that I want to tell. And they'll suddenly make sense. And there was a study done by Brendan Cohen-Sheehy and a group, and where they looked at brains under an fMRI. Okay, and they told them all of these stories. And not all of the stories made sense or were connected in any way, but they had the hypothesis that these stories will come together. Our brains will do something to help us remember them. So they took the participants, they looked at their brain while they were telling them these stories, and then they brought the participants back the next day. And when they brought them back the next day, they had the participants go under the fMRI machine and then tell them stories back, these unrelated, disjointed stories. And what they found was, when they looked at the brain, that the brain actually made those connections. So the stories that weren't connected, the brain connected to help the person remember them. Neurons play a role in this, oxytocin plays a role in this, the hippocampus. Our bodies are made for storytelling. Humans are made for storytelling. But what's important about storytelling? There was a question that I had before the talk about what makes a good story, right? How do you tell a good story? And maybe some of the things that we'll touch on today will help you tell a good story. But what's important to note is it takes practice to be a good storyteller. Some stories will be more effective than others, and it's about testing out those things. It's about being open and vulnerable. It's about trying something new and recognizing what the impact of that story is, how you told it, and who the audience is. So I just want to encourage everybody to engage in storytelling, test out new things, tell new stories. Tell those same stories that you've told your whole life, but also be willing to get out of your comfort zone and tell a story that, maybe is a little bit scary to tell. I think yesterday was a great example. We had James telling the story of his dad, which made me cry. And then we had Clark telling the story of his children, which also made me cry. Those aren't easy stories to tell. There's risk-taking involved in there. But the payoff, the connections that are built by being vulnerable, by sharing those, are so much deeper than most of the stories that we tell over and over. We want to capture the hearts of our listeners. Okay. Now I'm going to tell my story. I'm already crying. This is not good. So I'm going to take a deep breath here. I'm the technical community builder at Deepgram. I am a creator and one of the maintainers of the virtual coffee community. But this is not who I always was. 6 years ago, I was pregnant with my 4th child. Everything was normal. Everything was fine. And so I gave birth, and I knew that something was wrong right after it happened. And I went through this experience where I was in the worst pain of my entire life, and I had these pretty horrific symptoms. And I kept telling them in the hospital, something's wrong. And they said, this sometimes happens to moms of 4. Like, I don't think what's happening sometimes happens to moms of 4. And they sent me home, and it was over the weekend. A couple days later, I was still having these terrible symptoms, and I went in to see that OBGYN, and I told her, I'm still having these problems. And she said, well, you're not my problem. And in that moment, I never felt so hopeless, so alone, because here I was at my most vulnerable state, and she said I wasn't her problem. I wasn't a person, wasn't even a patient. I was a problem, and it was somebody else's problem. And that moment was the point of change for me. This is what started that rising action in my life, because I couldn't go back to being the same person after feeling that alone. And so a couple of weeks later, I ended up finding another doctor, and they said, oh, you have a hole the size of a 50-cent piece, which is like about that big, in between 2 of your organs that's connected them together. I don't think that that's something that happens to moms of 4, right? Like, it's wrong. But I had to fight to get that diagnosis. I had to fight to get that care. And I had to fight to overcome that loneliness. And it didn't stop when I found another doctor. I ended up having surgery about 6 weeks later, and they did not properly cap my morphine drip. And I overdosed on morphine. My heart rate was slowing. My breathing was slowing. And they had to give me Narcan, which undoes all of the effects of the morphine. And I had just gone through major abdominal surgery. So I came home from that experience after a week in the hospital, and I had PTSD. I had my first anxiety attack. I kept waking up at night thinking, I'm not breathing. I'm not breathing fast enough, and I would time my breaths, right? And I was familiar with panic attacks, and I knew at some point, like, this is a panic attack. It's my brain playing a trick on me. But I couldn't make it stop. And so I felt betrayed by my body because it didn't do what it was supposed to do. It broke, right? I felt betrayed by my mind because it wasn't doing what it was supposed to do. It kept telling me that I wasn't going to breathe anymore. And I couldn't focus. Every minute I spent with my kids, I replayed over and over in my head that doctor saying, "You're not my problem." I'm telling you, thousands of times a day. I'd be at a red light, it would go through my mind. I'd be at work, it would go through my mind. I was stuck. And then my husband, who had come into engineering, so he's a second career engineer, he was like, "You should learn how to code." This is like about 8 months later, and I'm still like, can't even keep a coherent thought. I should learn how to code, right? Like, yeah, that seems like the right thing. And I kept saying it. I'm like, are you kidding me, right? So I was like, fine. I will try free code camp, and then you will stop saying it to me, okay? And then we'll be done with this. And what happened was, joke's on me, because as soon as I started free code camp, that cycling of those memories, it stopped. And so I had waited a year to tell my brain to stop. I kept telling it to not do that thing, but coding was that thing. My brain was so focused on learning a new skill that it stopped. It gave me a break. It was therapy. But then it became more than that. It became a community of people. I met so many people who were transitioning into tech, or moms who had come in a couple of years ago. And I had taught college English for 10 years before this. I never felt that community that I felt in tech. So what started as therapy became a community, and it eventually became a career change. And so I went to boot camp. I feel like I totally cheated my way into boot camp. I went to Flatiron School, and I got a full scholarship, because why? You had to write an essay, which, like, definitely cheating. I taught college English for 10 years, right? Like, I'm sorry to anybody else who had to write that essay. And then I cheated even worse, because you had to write why were you coming into it. And I was like, well, I almost died, and this is going to fulfill my life. So, like, how are they not going to pick me, right? And so this now, I'm into this life-changing experience, but it gets even better than that. We had educational coaches. And my educational coach, her name was Katie McKenna, and she had read my essay. And the first or second time we met, she said, "Bekah, I've been through a trauma. Do you mind if I tell you about it?" Now, at this point, I was still feeling really low. Like, I was the only one that could understand my trauma. Nobody else had their organs rupture into each other in the United States last year, right? I didn't think anyone can understand. And then she said to me, I was run over by a semi-truck, and she told me her story. And she said words that I said to myself. The thoughts that she shared with me, I had thought. And suddenly I realized I wasn't alone. I wasn't stuck in that doctor's office as someone else's problem. There were people out there who had that experience, and they were willing to share. And so why am I telling you all of this, right? Well, the connection that we find through sharing our stories is often forgotten. We deprioritize telling stories, and we think of them as frivolous. But I think they're more important than ever. And it's gotten me to a point that I'm proud of who I am today. There's this physiological connection that happens when we share our stories. According to Ted Bauer in the neuroscience of storytelling, when we see or hear a story, the neurons in our brains fire in the same pattern as the speakers, and that's known as neural coupling. And what neural coupling is, it's our brains trying to make ourselves like the brain of the speaker. We make this connection, and our brain shifts to be like that person, to put ourselves in their shoes. A couple of weeks after that meeting with Katie, I had started writing down my story, and I said to her, Katie, I don't know why I'm writing my story. It doesn't make sense. And she said, Bekah, we don't share our stories for ourselves. We share our stories to invite other people to share theirs. And that was a really pivotal moment in my life to know that this is how we grow together. This is how we make connections. And this is how we change. This is how we make meaning out of our experiences rather than isolate ourselves and feel like we're the only one that knows that experience. So when we tell these stories, oxytocin is produced that creates this connection. But this connection is more than a personal connection. It's motivational, it's empowering, it's recognizing that you're not alone. It allows us to create bonds of trust, to take risks. It allows us to be more transparent and to grow. Because when we share our stories, people are more likely to share theirs. Katie has overcome so much in her career. By sharing her stories, she's created a business that helps to empower other people to share their own stories. But what's amazing about Katie is that she continues to share this experience. Her doctors told her she would never walk again, and she proved them wrong. They told her she probably would never have kids, and she proved them wrong again this last year when she had her daughter. That connection helps us to be motivated to keep going. There's a book called Stories That Stick by Kindra Hall, and she tells all of these fantastic stories, but one of the stories that I really like is the story of, she was getting on an airplane, and as she's boarding, there's this older woman in her 80s and her sister, and they're trying to get their luggage to the overhead bin, and they're really struggling. And so they ask the flight attendant, hey, can you help us out? The flight attendant says, sorry, because of my contract, I'm not allowed to help you do that. And so something happened, and the situation escalated, and the flight attendant ended up calling security on this 80-year-old woman and her sister, right? And the sister says to her, we haven't flown in a really long time, and we're really excited because we're going to a family reunion, and we're going to see people that we hadn't in a long time. And the flight attendant softened in that moment and said, I recently went to a family reunion, and started to share her story of her family reunion. And what happened was they discovered they both had Midwestern roots, and they were able to connect and move past that situation. By the end of the flight, they were hugging and saying goodbye and wishing each other well on the way. So what could have been a disastrous situation turned out to be a moment of bonding because the sister decided she was going to share what their experience was. And that was enough to make that connection and to divert that situation, to create a bond and move forward from that. So how do we stay connected? So this is the color slide that tells you we're gonna do some work, okay? So get your pens back out. We're gonna think through some things again. We wanna think about that story that you're working on, whether that's your origin story or maybe you have an idea for a different story to tell now. But we want to think about that emotion that we felt in that moment, okay? Where did you feel the emotion the strongest? So for me, in that hospital room, in that bed, that sense of hopelessness was something that I will never in my entire life forget. That moment when Katie shared her story with me, and I felt like I wasn't alone anymore. That's a feeling that I won't forget. The moments when people share their stories with you, when they're vulnerable, when they're open, that feeling that you get, that bonds us to that person. So think about that moment in your story that makes you feel that strongest emotion. Now, as you're examining that, as you're thinking about that, think about why you feel that way. Why did you feel that emotion? Why did you feel it strongly? And it might be that it reminds you of another story, and that connected you to that moment. Or it reminded you that you were stronger than you thought. Maybe it's a point when you're in an interview and the interviewer is looking at you, staring at you blankly the entire time, right? Anybody been in one of those interviews? There's no no feedback that you're getting, and then suddenly there's like a little smirk, and you're like, oh, I got this, I saw that, Maybe it's a time when you were overwhelmed giving a talk, where you got in front of a stage of people and you started crying and you thought, maybe I should run and just never show my face again. And then you look out into the audience and you see that one person who gives you that reassuring look. You take a deep breath and you know that you can keep going. Maybe it was a moment when you were diagnosed with ADHD and suddenly your life clicks and you're like, huh. And then you start to go through all of the cycle of understanding who you are as a new person. Think about that moment where you had that feeling. These are the moments that help us to connect to other people. And I think that it's important to know that oxytocin that's produced in these connections, that bonds us to people. It also helps us to remember those situations. And there's recent research that says that it also helps you to remember bad memories too, right? And so sometimes we have those bad memories, and it doesn't make sense all the time. I know that there have been times where this is not funny, but sometimes when things are really bad, then you just start to say that they're funny, right? It's because it helps you out a little bit. But I once had to we were on vacation, and my son broke out with all these circular rashes all over his body, and full on panic because I can't handle medical uncertainty. And we take him to the pediatric ER, and it is the same layout of the surgical center where I had my surgery, right? So immediately it's what am I doing? Who am I? Where am I? What am I? But those memories can be triggered in other ways. So when we're thinking about our stories, we're thinking about what stories do we want to tell? What stories are the ones that will connect us to other people in some way? And so as you're thinking about your story and how you're going to present these memories, think about the lasting impression that they're going to have on the people in front of you. And that's one of the ways you figure out how to tell a good story. It's that connection that comes from the story and how you make that connection with the people in front of you. So think about it. How will telling your story connect you to others? Now, if all of this biological proof is not enough for you, let's look at some historical proof as to why we are built for storytelling. So 700 BC is where we find the first recorded stories. We've got the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Iliad by Homer. And what are these stories? Well, the Iliad tells the story of Achilles and the conflict that he has with King Agamemnon. And I laugh because I know that name is gonna be one that I'm going to butcher, and yet I put it in the presentation anyway. But that story is telling a story of a hero. There's themes of fate and heroism and pride. Every Avengers movie ever, right? These are the stories that we continue to tell. Why? Because they're meaningful, they're inspirational, they motivate us, they persuade us, they get us excited to do something else. The drawings that you see up here are in the Chauvet cave. I did this twice in one slide, right? I've got Agamemnon and I've got a French word, and I've never taken any French, but I looked it up online, and I think they said Chauvet, so go ahead, feel free to correct me, that's fine too. But this dates back 36,000 years ago. They're sharing stories 36,000 years ago, and these are recorded stories, right? So this is the evidence we have that we were made for storytelling. But these are not the oral histories that we have. What are the stories that we pass down? There's epic poetry that's been told. There's myths that have been told. We are made for storytelling. We all have our own oral histories, right? I have a great story about a grandfather that I've never even met that I've told my kids. Those are the stories that are passed down. So as you're thinking about your stories, what are the stories that you continue to pass down? And it might be the same story that you've told a million times, but it still makes you laugh, or it still makes you cry, or it still makes you feel hope in a way like it did the first time. These are our stories that we're meant to share with other people to form those connections. Now, unfortunately, I think that we've lost a lot of these opportunities to tell our stories and to connect with other people, especially over the pandemic, right? We lost those chance meetings in the grocery stores. And I will say, this is a side note, but I really, before all of the trauma I went through, I hated crying. I still don't like crying, but I just kind of leaned into it now. It's like, that's your thing, crying. I've been in the cheese aisle crying in Kroger, right? Just telling my story to another mom or hearing her share her stories when we feel that loneliness and despair that we felt during the pandemic. But we don't have those same opportunities. We weren't getting together. And I think that we're very lucky to be here at that conference, to be able to have these chance encounters with someone and say oh, hey, you love to pour a whole bottle of hot sauce on your eggs for breakfast too, we have those opportunities to do that now. In the pandemic, there was this despair that happened. I don't know if you all, I don't think I really need to say show of hands if you felt the pandemic despair. Many of us did, right? And I remember there was a point where I had been working at my first tech job for about 8 months, and we're finally getting into good communication patterns. I felt like I knew what I was doing. I was feeling confident. And then the school called, and they were like, come pick up your kids' books. They're going to be home for the next 3 weeks while this pandemic, gets over, right? They were home for the rest of the year. And so I go pick up my kids' books, bring them home, and I have a message on Slack that says, from my boss, hey, do you have a minute to meet up, or something like that, And I should have known, but we lost our jobs. So now I've got my kids at home, and I don't have a job, and I've never interviewed for a tech job before. That was a conversation that I had. Hey, this seems like a good fit. Why don't we try this out and work together? So now I'm interviewing for the first time with 4 kids at home, doing school at home, and there was one moment where he's 5 at the time, 5-year-old, walks across in front of my desk, goes to my bathroom, and pees with the door open. And I'm like, this is absurd. This does not make sense. And I was crying every single night, and I don't know why it took me so long, but I finally said, oh, wait a minute. I know these feelings. I've done this before. I can do this again. This is how I felt when I went through trauma, except the difference is the entire world is going through trauma together. We're isolated. We have to be isolated, but that doesn't mean that we still can't get together online. And that's where I put out a tweet that said, does anybody want to get together for virtual coffee? And the very first virtual coffee happened in March of 2020, and it's still going today. Thanks. And it's still going because we're there to share our stories with each other. Because it wasn't just a pandemic thing. There is a need to get together, to learn from each other, and feel safe in a space where you can share that story, where you can cry in front of a group of people, where you can be angry in front of a group of people, where you can say, hey, is this feeling that I'm having valid? Or does this normally happen in a work situation, or is my work just really messed up, right? Having that ability to experience that finally made sense And so in a world that felt like loneliness was increasing, like we were stuck while the pandemic was moving all around us, finding those moments for chance encounters became essential to continue to grow, to get over that despair and that loneliness. I'm worried about us still, right? Like, we're still going through all of this together. And I'm worried that we're lacking those connections. And I'm particularly worried about companies who pivoted to remote work during the pandemic and haven't thought through what it means to create an online workspace that's safe for its employees. Because we don't have those chance encounters anymore. You can't walk by your coworker's desk and look at the picture of their kid. You can't overhear them at the water cooler. Are water coolers like even still a thing? Like if there was a water cooler and you overheard them, you can't glance over and look at that person's face and know they need somebody right now. We've lost the opportunity for chance interactions. And I want to say that, do I think that we can still form community and we can be open and vulnerable and we can be connected online? 100%, absolutely. But it takes work and it takes thought to make sure that happens. And what I've heard over the last couple years is we're all going to meeting after meeting. We're opting out of company social events because we're exhausted or we have too much work or we're just burnt out, right? We're prioritizing productivity over connection, and that's impacting us in every way. So how do we get started? Well, we tell our stories, right? Like that's what this talk is about. In the essay, Make Us React, the Neuroscience of Narrative, there was this really great takeaway. If you treat me well, in most cases, my brain will synthesize oxytocin, and this will motivate me to treat you well in return. So just think about that for a second. How we treat each other, what we share with each other, this is what helps us to create that connection. And if everything is a transaction in Slack or Discord or Teams or whatever you're using, then you aren't giving yourselves the opportunity for that connection. But when we take the time to do that, when we take the time to have those conversations, that creates trustworthiness. I listened to this podcast, I can't remember which one it was, but one of the things they talked about was the prolific meeting culture that is happening right now. And one of the things that they said is often people are putting meetings on calendars with some topic in mind, but they don't really want to talk about that thing, right? They just want to get together with other people and kind of like use that as an excuse. We've got to go over this spreadsheet, right? Like, no, we don't. It's okay to ask somebody if they want to meet to chat, right? Like, we've undervalued that so much. We've forgotten that need for connection, that need for conversation. It doesn't have to be a half an hour, it doesn't have to be an hour. And be like, hey, let's catch up for 10 minutes, you know? Hey, I'm gonna open a Zoom room and I'm just gonna hang out in here. If anybody wants to chat or wants to pop in, I'm gonna be doing work, but I'll say hi, right? We can all make those opportunities. We can help to build that culture where we value connection first. And when we do that, that's going to impact our work environment in a positive way. As part of this, storytelling can be part of that culture. This allows us to be not just another support person, not just another coworker, not just another cog in the wheel. When we tell our stories, when we create moments for connection, what we're doing is saying, I want to meet you as a person. Meet each other as people first. Our lives are complex. And often what we're doing is just saying like, hi, I'm Bekah, I'm the technical community builder at Deepgram, right? That's what I do, that's not who I am. Knowing who I am is going to build that connection, it's going to build that trust and that interaction. It's going to help us to grow as people. And somehow we just continue to undervalue it. We don't have time for it. And I know I'm guilty of that too, right? I've got to get this work done. That's not the most important thing. When we recognize each other as complex human beings, this allows us to be open. This allows us to have empathy for other people. It allows us to solve conflicts together. It allows us to disagree with each other and to be able to work through those disagreements, right? You're not holding something against somebody else, because what do you want to do? You want to be on the same team as them. You want to work together to figure that out. One of my best experiences interviewing ever was when I disagreed with the interviewer. And we had that conversation back and forth about why we didn't disagree, why we disagreed on this thing. And I knew, like, I can work with this person, right? Because they're willing to have this conversation, and we're still smiling at the end of it. We didn't agree at the end of that conversation, but we made that connection. And that's what allows us to grow as people. It allows us to grow as teams and as companies. It helps us to create a common culture and common goals. I just want to touch back on history a little bit. And Yuval Noah Harari's book, Sapiens, he talks about this idea that, human beings, we started working together, doing a hunting and gathering or whatever. But that's not what united us. What united us within those communities was the stories that we told and the stories that we shared together, right? When you experience something with somebody else, now you have your own story that you can take. You have that own connectedness. It created this type of culture where you knew that you can depend on other people and it would unite you going forward. And one of the problems that we're facing right now is it's a problem with culture, right? There's a lack of culture. What is culture, though? What is culture? Culture is that thing that allows us to grow together. It allows us to feel strong together. It allows us to move forward in a way where we feel safe, where we feel valued, where we feel heard and understood. And everybody's kind of talking about culture as a buzzword, but it's more than benefits. It's more than HR. It's more than your PTO policy. And what's important is that culture is created by the people that are there. It's created by what they're willing to share with each other. And it doesn't start at the bottom, right? It starts at the top with leadership. Are they willing to share their stories with you? Are they willing to share their time with you? Are they willing to listen to the stories that you have to tell? How do they interact with other people at the company? You invest in your people. How do you do this? You do this by telling stories that matter. Stories that allow us to have a shared understanding of what the mission of the company is, of who the people are, of the processes. But it's the story about how you came to be there together. I was supposed to say, anybody have glasses and contacts here? So does anybody? Glasses and contacts, right? I have both glasses and contacts, and they're expensive, right? Can easily spend $1,000 at the eye doctor. And if anybody is familiar with Warby Parker, I really love their mission, which I have up here. And I didn't really know that much about Warby Parker. It's an online eyeglasses store that sells glasses for much less expensive than you normally would pay. And I saw this in my Instagram Reels, I think, and I thought, well, okay, this is somebody else that's just trying to steal my money, because how can you sell glasses that are that cheap? And then I found out the story behind Warby Parker, and they do a good job with their storytelling. So what happened was one of their founders was on a backpacking trip, and he lost his glasses, and then discovered glasses are really expensive. And so his first semester of grad school, he just sat there squinting because he couldn't afford to buy more glasses. And what he learned was There's basically one company that's in control of manufacturing all the glasses, and they make them ridiculously expensive. And that's not okay, right? Because there are 2.5 billion people around the world that need glasses to see. And people have a right to be able to see. And so Warby Parker came out of this idea of everybody has a right to be able to see. They have a right to feel comfortable in their skin and to be wearing glasses that make them feel good about themselves. And so Warby Parker was formed, and as part of it, I think for every pair of glasses that are sold, they also donate glasses to somebody else. And so what they've done is they've shared this story, their founding story. And it came down to the fact that somebody was in need. There was another human being that was in need, and they told their story. And they related it to those 2.5 billion people around the world who also are in need. Many of those who don't have the ability to see without glasses at all and who don't have the ability to buy glasses. And so they created this culture around helping people by recognizing that there's a shared humanity here and figuring out how we can help each other. It starts when someone shares. This is how the connections happen. This is how strong culture happens. It can be in your mission statement. It can be part of your onboarding. It's part of your leadership. It's part of that mentoring experience. You can build it into your culture. There's a company called 3M, and I love that they've really embraced this innovative storytelling as part of their culture. And one of my favorite stories from them comes from one of their lead scientists, was in the choir at his church, and his bookmark kept falling out of the hymnal, right? And that's super annoying. And so he developed Post-it notes, right? So what came from a need, an annoyance, was that Post-it notes were created. And they've leaned into this. They're the people that are on phone calls for sales. They tell stories to share with their potential customers about how they could use their products to empower their company. It's all about telling the story. When they do their strategic planning, they do strategic narrative to tell the story of what the goals are, what the mission is, to get their company to buy into it and to understand on a human level, beyond just the data and the goals and the KPIs and the OKRs and whatever other letters that you want to throw in there. They tell the story to connect and get everyone on board. When you share your story, it invites somebody else to share their story with you. It's a perfect opportunity when we mentor other people, when we help to onboard new people onto our team, to be able to share that story together. Share your story with your new teammate in an effort to connect to them and allow them to share their story with you. And then you can coach them in their story. I don't know if anybody has onboarded recently, but it's been about a year since I've been at Deep Graham and had to do all these meetings and meet all of these people. And you always get the question, or it's not really a question, it's a command, really. Tell me about yourself, right? Like, okay, like, I don't really know what to tell you, right? Like, if somebody has a good idea of what to say for that, we're gonna work on that next. Help your mentees to figure out what to tell. Don't just say, tell me about yourself. Ask the questions that help them. Be the example for telling about yourself. All right, so this is the color slide where you're gonna do your work again. So take out your pens and pencil and tell me about yourself. Right. Think about that question. And I know that probably at this conference, you've told other people about yourself already, right? 10 times maybe. There's an opportunity to do it 10 more times at least at the conference today, right? Think about that story. Think about the word that you wrote at the beginning of this talk. What is that story? What is in the moment in the story where you felt that emotion? What is the moment in the story where you felt connected to someone else? And as you think about this, think about who your audience is. Because when a recruiter says, tell me about yourself, there's a story for that. When somebody at your lunch table says, "Tell me about yourself," there's a different story for that, right? When you get up on stage and you're telling people who you are, there's a story for that. Think about who you're talking to and how that impacts how you present that story. Focus on one example, one moment, that moment that you overcame stage fright, the moment that you created a strategy to improve efficiency in your company by 30%, the moment when you improved onboarding of your new teammates by implementing a storytelling strategy, that time that you came into tech from a non-traditional background. Think about that moment. And then think about 3 plot points. We've got that plot diagram again. And think about how all of those impact this story of who you are today. I have different versions of my story. It depends on the audience, right? Like, how deep into the trauma do you want to get? Or like, what vocabulary is okay for me to use? Because there's some really gross details I can give you. Are you the type of audience that wants the gross details? I spared them for you today. But I definitely have told that version of the story, depending on who I'm talking to. All right, let's hold on to that. We'll come back to these stories. I'm going to talk a little bit about imagination and innovation for a while. Does anybody know who Neil Gaiman is? Any Neil Gaiman fans? No, not anybody's real excited, like, woo, yeah, Neil Gaiman. Neil Gaiman is a creative genius, exactly what he is, but he's a storyteller, right? He writes science fiction, he has television shows, he's done all of these great and creative things. And I was really lucky, about a year ago, he came to Pittsburgh, that's close to me, and I went to listen to him talk. He did a reading, he answered questions, and I went with my brother. And so it was a really great experience because there's a different feeling that you get from having someone in front of you. Being able to see their expressions, being able to hear the intonation of their voice, noticing how they move along the stage, how they smirk when they're asked a question. You come out of that experience feeling really excited and energized. And Neil Gaiman talked about his experiences with all different types of audiences. He did his reading, and I came out of there knowing, like, I want to do something big with my life. And there's this story that he tells in 2007. China had its first ever state-sponsored science fiction convention. And so he said to them, why now? Like, why have you waited this long to do this? And what they told him was that China had historically been a culture of magical and radical invention. But right now, they were kind of stuck. They could build the cool things, but they weren't imagining the cool things. And so they decided to figure out why that was. And so they came to the US and they interviewed people from Apple and Google, I believe. And they found that they had one thing in common. Everyone they interviewed read science fiction as kids. Before we innovate, we need to imagine, right? And sometimes our stories are personal stories, but I want to say that there is value in all stories. Okay, so we're going to play a game right now. I am going to give you a description, and you're going to tell me where this comes from and what year it happened. So this is a story about a lunar spacecraft and retro rockets. The physical descriptions and functionality resembled Apollo 11. Anyone know? All right. Next slide. 1865. Let me go back for a second. Lunar spacecraft, retro rockets, Apollo 11. 1865, Jules Verne wrote about this. There was inspiration here. There was imagination that was happening. Let's do another one. All right, a story about telephones acting as one brain, kind of like the modern internet. Anyone know this one? 1964. Arthur C. Clarke, dial F for Frankenstein. Couple more. Somebody's got to know this one. A communication device that looks like a razor phone appearing in a TV show. So there's a clue. TV show? Star Trek. See, all right, we got some Trekkies here. 1966. A team of scientists use a mini spaceship to treat a blood clot in the brain. And this is not, what's that kid show with Miss Frizzle? It's not that one, okay? Rugrats, it's not Rugrats either. It's Fantastic Voyage, okay? So 1966. This might be the last one. Much like the modern earbuds, a thimble radio that goes in the ear and plays music or talk shows. Need like some thinking music. Fahrenheit 451, 1953. So all these things, these are ways to be inspired. We can be inspired by fictional stories. We can be inspired by nonfiction. The point is that we're sharing this experience together. There are startups out there that are taking science fiction and actually making it happen. They're turning it into real products. It starts with imagination, and then it moves to innovation. And I think that it's important to note that stories matter, and it doesn't matter if you're the one that is solving the problem in the story, right? We need imagination for innovation. So maybe you're the one that's telling the story, and somebody else is the one creating the startup that figures out how to implement that thing. All stories are important. Innovation comes out of a desire to solve our own problems, right? And identifying those things. I'm going to play a clip from my podcast. I co-host the Virtual Coffee podcast. And this is a story from Matt McGinnis. He was a math teacher, and he found that he was pretty annoyed with having to sell some of his season tickets for the Blue Jays. And so he decided to innovate his way out of this process with a very imaginative way. So I'll let him do the talking here.
I'm a big baseball fan. I've got my little Blue Jays hat in the background on the here behind me, and we love going to the home opener, which is the first baseball game of the year. And I had gone, and we buy tickets, but they're always sell out, so you have to buy resale, and resale is like 3 times the price. And we paid, that one year, we paid like $110, which was outrageous at the time, to sit in $20 seats at like the top of the stadium. And I was so upset by this. And then one of my friends couldn't come, so I tried to scalp the ticket. So I was like outside the stadium and I like had a couple of bottles of juice to give myself the courage to do it. And I'm standing outside the stadium with my best scalper brothers who like, tickets? Who needs tickets? And I remember, there's 50,000 people there. Of course, like a friend walks by and he's like, what in the hell are you doing? And what in the heck are you doing? And then I'll never forget this mom and her daughter. The daughter must have been like 17, 18 years old, right? And they're walking by, and I'm out there, just tickets, I need a ticket. And she so politely says, no, thank you. Everyone just ignores you. She's like, no, thank you. And she looks at me and then looks down at my shirt, and I've got my university Western shirt on. And she gives it, like, her face just drops, and she looks at her daughter, who's like also got a Western shirt on. And just has this like sad look of horror as they walk into this. This is what my daughter's gonna be. But anyways, that whole experience was really upsetting. And so I learned that if you bought season tickets for all 90 games in a season, then you would get like a 15% discount, and then I could get the $20 ticket. And so, of course, what's a reasonable thing to do? Spend $9,000 on season tickets. Yeah, so I basically took 2/3 of my savings in my bank account, and I fronted the money on season tickets. But my theory was I could sell them at face value to my friends. And since I got this like 15% discount, that would more than make up for the gap, and Pam and I could go to 3 or 4 games for free, which is all I really wanted. But to do that, I needed to figure out how to price all these tickets. And so I wrote a Electron desktop app that went and scraped all the data from BlueJays.com and scraped all the data from StubHub, and I wrote an algorithm to, if you scrape StubHub one day and you scrape it the next day, you can figure out what tickets are not there anymore, and then you can figure out what sold and for what price, since you knew all the things. And so I built a really nice, clean data set, and then I trained an algorithm to price my tickets. And again, I have this Electron app, and I just click a button, price all my tickets, send an email to my friends, and then people just earmarked what tickets they want. And it worked. And I did that I've been doing that for 4 or 5 years now, or 6 years. There's a 2-year gap that I decided not to renew because of COVID. And then that got the attention of IBM. I mean, hey, that's a really awesome project. And that's what kind of opened that door.
So maybe not all of us are going to write an Electron app and create algorithms, scrape data to sell our season tickets. But what Matt did was he innovated to solve a problem that he had. And what happened because of that was he was recruited by IBM and by Microsoft. And so he went from being a math teacher to spending time working there, and now he owns his own startup. So being able to share those stories to allow us to use our imagination and to innovate becomes an inspiration to those around us too. As part of these experiences, I think it's important to recognize that we don't just share the good things that happen in our lives, right? We have to share the failures too. And I think it's really important for companies to be sharing their failures. And this might seem counterintuitive, right? Why do you want to share the times that do you want to dwell on what made you feel bad? It's not about feeling bad. When you share your failures, you're more likely to succeed because you examine what happened in those failures. And what you do is you create a culture where people trust each other, where they respect each other, and where they know they don't have to be perfect all the time. If you're only sharing the times that you succeed, then the focus becomes perfectionism. I have to succeed because this is the only thing that's valued. What should be valued is all of the experiences and what you do with those experiences. And in fact, I think it's PayPal's Senior Director of Innovation, Michael Tedasco, his team has built a miniature failure museum where it's this micro model of the PayPal campus and the failures that have happened along the way. And it's to encourage that culture because even if you're sharing your stories, the person that starts next week might not hear that story, right? So figure out a way to preserve those stories, to share it with others, and to make sure that they know that it is okay to do something that fails. I think Thomas Edison failed thousands of times with a carbon filament light bulb, thousands of times, and got it right the one time and changed the world, right? So it's about what you do with your failure. And a lot of times we don't talk about that. We only talk about that moment that we succeeded. And it's doing a disservice to everyone around us to not share that we failed 800 times before that, right? I'm not perfect. I messed it up. But this is what I did after I messed up. I went back and I thought about what happened in that moment. All right. Storytelling drives persuasion, and hopefully this is going to help you to tell a good story. So I am going to put my English teacher hat back on, and I'm going to teach you a little bit more. So when we want to persuade, there's this thing called the rhetorical triangle, right? And this goes all the way back to Aristotle, and we've got these 3 planes of the rhetorical triangle: ethos, pathos, and logos. And up till now, we've depended really on pathos. That's that emotional connection that you make through that storytelling, okay? Then we have ethos, which is credibility. So if you're thinking about submitting a CFP to that conf, think about why you are the person that should be giving that talk. Why are you the person that should be doing this storytelling? That's your credibility. What makes you uniquely qualified? And then logos, that's the logic. How are you backing that up? How are you demonstrating? Where are the numbers or the research or the experience that you have that show you know what you're talking about? We spend a lot of time persuading people, whether or not we know it. It's maybe I'm persuading you that I'm the right person for the job, or I'm persuading you to go to the water park with me and go on water slides, even though you don't want to. You're persuading your kids to do their homework, right? All of these things happen. Pathos gets you in the door. It makes that connection. But if you really want to seal the deal, that's where you add logos and ethos. When you're in an interview, you want your interviewer to think like, oh, that person is really cool. I would like to work with them, right? But what is best is if they say, that person is really cool and I would like to work with them, and they're so smart, they're gonna rock this job, right? It's that extra point that's really going to solidify whether or not you make it onto the team. All right, so let's go back to our stories for a second. And we want to think about how we're using ethos, pathos, and logos. And depending on what the purpose of your story is, your triangle might not be so balanced, right? So I can't remember. Who can tell me, like, the triangle? Is isosceles the balanced one? Equilateral. It doesn't have to be equilateral unless you really have an argument that you want someone to remember. It can be a janky triangle. I think that's a technical term. So if your purpose is to motivate or persuade, so look at that story. Are you motivating or persuading your audience? Where is your credibility? Now notice, before I started talking about credibility, I said I was going to put my English teacher hat back on, right? I didn't say, I'm going to put my front-end developer hat on and teach you about the rhetorical triangle, because that doesn't make sense, right? That doesn't make me credible to be a front-end developer and to teach you about this. And you may have also noticed that I am not a neurologist or a neurobiologist, maybe in a next career. So what I've done instead, because I don't have that credibility, is I've cited experts in the field throughout the talk, because it's important to understand why we are made for storytelling. And I can't do that. I can't lean on my credibility. I have 10 years teaching college English. I have no years teaching neurobiology, right? So I look to the people that do know what they're talking about and bring them into the conversation. Logos. How are you sharing your meaning? How are you providing evidence of what you're trying to persuade or convince your audience of? It doesn't have to be facts from studies. It doesn't have to be numbers. It can be a story that demonstrates that you know what you're doing. Think about that story. And I think that we've covered a lot of capturing that emotion, right? Those feelings of connection that you get. But if you're trying to motivate, you're trying to persuade, trying to tell the full story, think about it from this perspective. Oh no, I ruined it. Pretend you didn't see that. Who knows who the youngest self-made billionaire, female billionaire is? Not Kylie Jenner. She's not self-made. But before Kylie Jenner, we'll just pretend like Kylie Jenner's not there. Since you've never seen this slide, it's Sarah Blakely. Sarah Blakely is the founder of Spanx, which is a women's shapewear line. And she does a really great job of capturing the founder's story, right? Spanx founder Sarah Blakely was getting ready for a party when she realized she didn't have the right undergarment to provide a smooth look under white pants. Armed with scissors and sheer genius, she cut the feet off her control top pantyhose, and the Spanx revolution began. With a focus on solving wardrobe woes, the Spanx brand has grown to offer bras, underwear, leggings, active, and more. Spanx has secured its place in women's hearts in pop culture with daily mentions everywhere from CNN to SNL. So what we're seeing in this short period of them describing Sarah and who she is, we get the founder's story. What happened? Something wasn't right, and she solved the problem. She innovated using her imagination, right? We get that. They also demonstrate their credibility there. by talking about being on in CNN and Forbes magazine and Time. So they're demonstrating that credibility, but they're also like throwing that appeal to pathos in there. One, with recognizing that Sarah had a problem that she innovated and worked with, but also two, by not taking themselves seriously, because they mention that they've been mentioned on SNL, and they also talk about keeping butts covered from Savannah to Singapore, right? They don't take themselves too seriously. So within this description, they're balancing that rhetorical triangle. And I think that it's important to note that this ends in a way that connects you to the story and empowers you even more. Spanx also shapes the world by focusing on our mission to help women feel great about themselves and their potential. So it kind of takes you through this entire journey in just 2 short paragraphs of the inception of the company and what they want to do. They bring you on board with their mission. As we connect to each other through this type of storytelling, our vagal nerve activity increases. And what happens with this increase is that our attention and our focus also increases. It allows us to put ourselves in the spot of the storyteller as well. So we start to relate to the storyteller. We start to put ourselves in the storyteller's shoes. And that's what we want. You're more likely to remember the story when that happens. Now, Katie wrote a book, Katie McKenna, my educational coach, called How to Get Run Over by a Truck, right? That story was the same story that she told me. Did I buy the book anyway? Absolutely, right? I already knew the story. I heard it from her first person, but I wanted to read it too. I felt connected to her in that moment, and to be able to share and see what she wrote became even more motivating to me. And not only to me, but every single person in her audience. They learned about her story, but they learned about patient care reform. And so that story has impacted so many more people through the telling in her book. All right, we're gonna jump to another story of military intelligence. I found this really, really fascinating. So there's this company called Useful Fiction, and they are creating what they call fictional intelligence, like a subgenre, I guess. And their novel called Ghost Fleet was on, I think made the New York Times bestsellers list. And what they're doing, they're coming from their military background. They're taking what they've learned as military strategists and they're putting it into fiction. But the fiction that they're writing is based on their understanding. So they're creating this scenario, and they're saying, this is why it's likely to play out in this way. That book has 27 pages of endnotes to explain why it makes sense for this to happen. But they're not stopping with just writing novels to convince the reader of sharing historical information. They're working with companies and with military strategists to take what I call dull, boring, dry, and dense writing and to tell the story. So taking that spreadsheet, instead of giving me the spreadsheet, telling me the story of the spreadsheet. Michael, if you're watching, I'm looking at you. Taking those white papers, removing the complexity and the density by telling the story of why it matters. When we take the data and tell the story, when we take the PowerPoint and build a story with it instead, we have to think about the purpose. What is the point that we're trying to get across here? Why is this important? How are we sharing these goals with others in ways that they can connect and are meaningful? Being able to tell the story of your data, being able to take all of the dense, dry information that you have and transform it into a narrative also allows you to present it to a much broader audience of people. People are more likely to learn and to understand when they're told in story format. So you can tell those technical details and you can reach this many people. Or you can figure out how to tell the story of those details and reach this many people. And instead of doing that, and instead of investing time in that, we also just try and do it and think about the fastest way that we can get it done, right? It's about the most people that we can touch, that we can connect with, that we can build trust with. Part of this is knowing your audience, too. Understanding who you're talking to, how you can relate this information to them. This allows them to change their attitudes on information, to think about why they feel one way, and after your talk, after you've presented the information, whether or not that still makes sense, right? Has anybody in here ever changed their opinion? Why have you changed your opinion? What was that moment? There's so many moments in my life. I used to be kind of callous, right? I was like, everybody has a tough life. You just got to push forward, right? And then I discovered when somebody else has to change your catheter bag and babysit you and help you shower, that there are a lot of struggles that you need other people to get through. A little humility did me good, I think. It allowed me to change my opinions and to recognize that we all struggle in different ways. We all have these stories, whether we tell them or not, that impact the way that we understand ourselves and others. I was lucky enough, about a year after the trauma I went through, I went and talked to the hospital administrators. For a year straight, I had yelled as loudly as I could and talked about how terrible that experience was, until somebody from the office reached out to me and said, hey, want to chat? Sure. So 2 weeks later, I was in a conference room with 5 men. I brought my dad along because I didn't think I would be able to get through it without having that support. When I went in there, I had spent those 2 weeks preparing for that moment. I had researched patient care approaches. I knew all of the medical terminology. I knew what happened to me. I could talk about it with a medical vocabulary, and I could talk about why it happened. I could talk about the missteps, and I can talk about the problems with patient care at the hospital. And so one of the highlights of that experience was when the CEO of the hospital said to me, do you have a medical background? I said, no, I have a master's in English. And he looked at the director of the OBGYNs like, whoa. And he nodded and he said, she talks about it very well. Yeah, I do. Because I knew that's what I needed to get things to change. I couldn't go in there and tell my story. That's not what I wanted. I wanted change to happen. I wanted that same feeling of loneliness to never happen to anybody else ever again. And to do that, I had to be credible. I had to know what I was talking about. I had to know how to talk about it. And I had to stay focused the whole time. You change opinions by being open, by being vulnerable, and by building your credibility. I think we all love a good underdog story, and there's a reason for it. There's actually a lot that's written about why we relate to underdog stories, right? And a lot of the reasons, it's because we can put ourselves in the shoes of that person and think hey, I have hope. If they could do it, I could do it too, right? You can start something new. You can create change. You can take action. So I'm going to ask you to, we'll just play a little game, but I don't have any slides for this one. So I want you to guess who I'm talking about. This woman was born into poverty to a single mother. She was abused. She was pregnant at 14. She miscarried later. After that, while still in high school, she moved to Nashville to be with her dad and eventually found work at a radio station. And from there, she was able to create a talk show and then move to Chicago. Anybody know? Oprah, good job. We get excited by that story because if she can do it, then we can too, Well, I won't make you guess this one, but does anybody know who J.R.R. Tolkien is? Anyone know what he's written? When did he write The Lord of the Rings? He was 45. I don't know if it was during World War II. 45 years old. I'm 37. I still have time. I have time to write my version of The Lord of the Rings, right? Toni Morrison was 40 when she wrote her first novel, 56 when she won the Pulitzer, and 62 when she won the Nobel Prize. We like the underdog story because it gives us hope. We still have time to do it. And then we see other stories like Malala. So the Taliban took over her town when she was 11. She spoke against what was happening. She wanted to see the education of girls her age, and she was shot in the head when she was 15 years old. And what did she do? She went forward and she continued to talk about why girls her age needed to be educated. And she won a Nobel Peace Prize at 17, the youngest woman ever, I believe. It gives us hope. It gives us motivation. Look what she did. And she was 17. So why is storytelling important in a digital world? Why is it important to us in tech? We have to make space to make these connections, right? It's work. We have to do it. It's about connecting ourselves to our friends, to our families, our teammates, other people in the company, everyone here. It's about telling our stories. It's about talking about our failures. It's about learning and growing together. All right, so one more time, let's talk about our stories. What's the purpose of your story? What is the story that you're telling, and what are you trying to get across? If you're trying to show value, you can say, I've onboarded 1,000 new open source contributors last year, right? If you're trying to motivate, you can say, I made it into tech after my CS professor told me I would never pass his class. You can tell a story to connect to others. I went to boot camp too. To persuade others. You should use my product or hire me because why? Think about your story that demonstrates what you want to get across. Now, before we go, I want to talk about the importance of listening. and it might sound counterintuitive. We're talking about storytelling. Why do we need to listen, right? Like stories come out of our mouths. You learn through listening. Connection is not a one-way street. Has anybody read Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss? Yes. Such a good book. It's all about listening. If you have like a toddler or a very like obstinate child, it works. He was a hostage negotiator, so I feel like he's got the kids down too. But he says listening is a martial art. It's balancing the subtle behaviors of emotional intelligence and the assertive skills of influence to gain access to the mind of another person. It's not about passive listening. It's about active listening to understand the other person, to hear their story, to engage in their story. Remember, your brain is lighting up when you hear their story. Let your brain light up. Enjoy that experience of hearing someone else's story without thinking, what am I going to say next? Right? Make the connection. So this is it. This is my challenge to you. We need storytelling. We need it to connect, to learn. We need it for psychological safety. We need it to empathize with the struggles of other people so we can feel excited when other people succeed and we can overcome adversity together. Let's think about how we can learn about each other first without saying, this is the to-do list for the day. This is who I am beyond my job. This is me as a complex human being. So my challenge to you is when you're listening to somebody else's story, take the time to listen to that story. We've got the rest of the day at the conference. The challenge is to find another person and tell your story, right? Just one person, if you want to talk to more people, but be willing to listen to their story, be willing to be open and vulnerable, and to make that connection. So thank you, everybody.
I wasn't going to do this, but she triggered a bunch of stuff for me. So I'm going to tell the other side of what happens when you tell a story. The year is 2000, and a pandemic came. And this is a picture of me and my son. He's 14 or 15 at that time. We started getting into skiing. Where I live, skiing is basically like strapping some sticks to your feet and hoping you don't die in 30 seconds before you get to the bottom. So he comes to me in 2019. He says, "Dad, I want to learn how to ski." Cool, let's go. And if anybody's got older teenagers, you start to slip away time with them, and you want to grab onto your babies and get as much time as you want. And of course, scrolling through TikTok and all that shit, you don't have those moments. But you go skiing, can't really scroll through TikTok, especially when you have 30 seconds to the end of your life. So we went skiing, and then the pandemic came. Now, I skied at the same hill where I live now when I was a kid, but there was this thing that happened back then called snowboarding, and it was super cool, but I was scared. I didn't think I was good enough to do it. I never tried. And ever since then, I've regretted not doing it. So when my son said I would like to ski, I said, cool, maybe I have an opportunity. So in 2020, he got a pair of skis. I bought a snowboard. My wife said, "What the hell? The hell do you know about snowboarding?" Can anybody guess what my answer was? I'm learning on YouTube. I saw it, I can do it. It's fine. Strap 2 sticks or 1 stick on. So I went snowboarding. And it was a good year to do that because we were all stuck inside, and I lived next to the hill. But on February 25th, at about 9:30 p.m., I was doing 25, and I wasn't with my son at the time. This is the one time he didn't come. It was my 200th run. When I hit a piece of ice, caught the front edge of my board, went head over heels, dislocated my shoulder, broke my arm, and tore up my rotator cuff. This is me in the ER as the pain started to slip down, and I'm looking at my arm, and unlike, what did you say it was called? Oxytocin, I was on Oxycontin, the other stuff. This was after I was watching the amount of morphine that they were putting through my body. If you look, you can see there's a blue strap around my arm. They kicked my wife out as I was getting pumped full of stuff, and 7 guys walked into the room. They knocked me out, and it took 7 guys to pull my arm out of my boob, I guess, and put it back into the socket. You can see the look of disgust on Carrie's face, almost like, shit, I knew this was gonna happen. Here we go. And for the next 9 months, 10 months, I didn't really have use of my arm. And I told that story, or at least I put some random shit on the internet. And I got a lot of things like, why would you do this at the age of 40, right? I got a lot of support, but I also got a lot of, it's just a dumb move, you 40-year-old. But the following year, I got back on my snowboard, to which I also got a lot of, why are you doing this? And some of my staff even encouraged me before this conference to please not get on the snowboard until after the conference. But that's me holding the board with my right hand because I can't and I don't have enough rotation in my left. But I got back on it. And I don't tell that story because of the physical pain and to try to grave emotion. What I tell is because I told and was vulnerable about that, fast forward to yesterday, and a gentleman here goes, "How's your arm doing?" And instead of feeling alone, I felt like a human. Because they weren't asking me about tech, they were asking me about me. And there's not a day that goes by that I don't feel pain in my shoulder. And I'm not reminded that I was going 25 miles an hour when I flipped head over heels in my 40-year-old ass body. Maybe shouldn't have been on that board. But I had the best year of my life with my kid. And we continue to do it. I get to do it with my daughter now as well. So when we are vulnerable and we take these times to connect with one another, we see each other as a much different place. Now fast forward to the fall, this past fall, and I've been doing a lot of self-inflection, and it's funny you brought Sarah Blakely up because I'm in the same organization that she is. Some of you saw this video in Wisconsin, but this is the power of a team and the power of a tribe. There's a gentleman on the other end. I'll start to play the video. I'm not good with doing these like rah-rah exercises, but I've been trying to lean in to be a little different. This is a steel point arrow. It's on my neck, if you haven't noticed. It feels like a very vulnerable spot right down here. And there's a piece of wood, and this arrow is pushed to this piece of wood. Now, I had no problem doing all the other exercises, the walking on glass and breaking boards and walking through coals. That was all easy. My dome could not get through this, and you can see me struggling. You can see me leaning into that thing. And in my head, all I could think about was death. I didn't know why I was doing this thing. I don't know why I trusted the other guy. Well, of course, she had to adjust it. Let's make sure it goes all the way through. So I'm 3 times in, and at this point, my neck and my throat hurt. And every time I lean in, it gets a little harder, and you can see a few of the chaps in the back going. And if the sound was on, you would hear all kinds of, like, "You've got this, you can do this." Tribe of strangers. The guy from New York I knew for all of, 3 hours. And I finally broke the stick. But what it was about was my own self-confidence. That whole thing, that stick was going to break. I was never going to, well, I guess we did have to sign some waivers that there was a potential of losing your vocal cords. But it was about self-confidence. And for me, it all kind of clicked. I didn't trust myself. I didn't trust the thoughts in my head. And the snowboard and all this kind of came rushing back. And I just tell that story because when we're vulnerable and we tell our stories and we engage with people and we meet the right people, the right tribe, and we do the right thing, and you get rid of the negative people and the naysayers and the trolls and all that other bullshit that's out there, you have real connections with real people that want to lift one another up, grow yourself, and in times of bad and in times of good, you've got a tribe. And there's not one tribe you need, there's many tribes. So find your tribe. 4 o'clock today, closing. After that, the crew and I are going to wrap all this stuff up in cellophane and shove it on a truck. I'm going to try to convince them to go get tacos afterwards. So if you're still around, thank you, and come on by. Buy some stuff. Again, let's send a big thank you to all the sponsors for making this happen. It's just amazing to have them here. Yes, clap it up. I know we're running a little late, so let's just start the next session at 10:45, so you got 15 minutes. And with that, Bekah Dad, and everybody who was online saying such nice things about your talk. Let's give Bekah the biggest of rounds of applause. Absolutely. Absolutely touching, the vulnerability to stand up and tell your story, whether it's in front of one or it's in front of thousands, is not easy. And like I said before, you're an amazing human, and the people who said you couldn't keynote before fucked up. Thank you, everybody. The next session will start at 10:45, so in 15 minutes. Have a great day, and I'll see you at closing.